She was not supposed to be beautiful. That was the first thought that tore through Aldric Cavendish, the Duke of Ravensmoor, like a blade pulled fresh from the fire, sharp, burning, and utterly without mercy. He had stood in the great vaulted entrance of Ravensmoor Manor 100 times before, beneath its cold marble arches and its portraits of stern, unsmiling ancestors. He had welcomed diplomats and earls, and once, briefly, a prince who smelled of bergamot and too much ambition. He had done all of these things with perfect, glacial composure. But he had never, not once in his 32 years upon this earth, stood quite so still as he did on that rain-soaked October evening when the carriage door swung open and she stepped down onto the gravel drive. She wore black, deep, unrelenting black, from the high collar at her throat to the hem that swept the wet stone. A widow's colour, though she had never been a wife. It was the colour of mourning for a father, he supposed, for Lord Ashmore had been dead these 3 weeks past, and it was Lord Ashmore's debts, enormous and grotesque as gargoyles, that had brought this arrangement into being. A betrothal of convenience, a marriage in name only. Those had been the precise terms discussed between his solicitor and the Ashmore estate, exchanged in dry, business-like letters that spoke of duty and settlement, and not once, not a single syllable of beauty. And yet, she paused at the foot of the carriage step, one gloved hand resting upon the lacquered door, and she tilted her face upward toward the manor, toward him, though she could not yet have seen him standing in the shadow of the great doorway. The wind moved, and the veil she wore, that modest scrap of black lace pinned to a small, neat bonnet, lifted, just slightly, just for the breadth of a single heartbeat, and Aldric Cavendish saw her face. He forgot, in that moment, how to breathe. Her name was Miss Vivienne Ashmore, and she was, without question or caveat, the most arresting creature he had ever laid eyes upon. Let us step back, dear listener, for a moment. Let us walk backward through the corridors of time, as one might walk backward through the long, dim gallery of Ravensmoor, passing portrait after portrait of men who wore duty like armor and emotion like a wound. Aldric was 8 years old when he first understood that love was a dangerous thing. His mother had loved his father with the full, unguarded ferocity of a woman who did not yet know better. And his father, the previous Duke of Ravensmoor, a man of great beauty and greater appetite, had repaid that love with spectacular indifference, with prolonged absences, and finally with an affair so public and so prolonged that half of London whispered about it at dinner tables, and the other half shouted about it at gaming clubs. His mother withered, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, the way a great house withers when no one lights the fires any more. By the time Aldric was 12, she was gone. Not dead, merely absent from herself in every way that mattered. He had carried that lesson like a stone in his chest ever since. He did not want a love match. He did not want a wife who would look at him with those particular eyes, hopeful, tender, terrifyingly open. He wanted a sensible arrangement, an intelligent woman of appropriate birth who would manage his household, appear on his arm at the required occasions, and ask nothing more of him than civility and a comfortable allowance. Vivienne Ashmore, on paper, had seemed precisely that. Daughter of a viscount, now deceased, and spectacularly insolvent. Educated, they said she spoke 3 languages and kept meticulous household accounts. Quiet, they said, unremarkable in countenance. Those last words had been the reassurance he had not known he was looking for. Unremarkable in countenance. He had breathed easier upon reading them. He understood now, standing in the shadow of his own doorway, with the cold October rain pattering against the stone behind him, that whoever had written those words had either been blind or a fool of the most spectacular variety.
She came inside. Her companion, a small, nervous woman of middle years named Mrs. Prentice, who had clearly survived the carriage ride from London by the sheer force of anxious prayer, bustled in behind her, murmuring apologies about the weather and the state of the roads. The footmen took their cloaks. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, appeared with her customary efficiency, bobbing a curtsy and speaking of rooms prepared and supper waiting. And through all of it, Vivienne Ashmore stood quietly in the centre of the entrance hall, her black-gloved hands clasped before her, her dark eyes moving with measured, unhurried calm round the vast space, taking in the marble columns, the sweeping staircase, the enormous chandelier above with its 100 unlit candles, the cold and the grandeur, and the faint smell of beeswax and old stone. She did not look impressed. She did not look frightened. She looked, Aldric thought, with a faint, disconcerting jolt, as though she were assessing a property she had come to inspect and reserving her judgment until further evidence presented itself. He stepped forward from the doorway then, because to remain lurking in shadows any longer would have been undignified. "Miss Ashmore," he said. She turned, and he saw her face again, fully this time, with no veil between them and no mercy. Wide, dark eyes, the precise color of strong coffee, or perhaps mahogany in firelight, a straight, determined nose, a mouth that was— He stopped himself, a mouth that was not his concern. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was low and steady, with only the faintest trace of something careful in it, like a musician who has tuned their instrument with great deliberateness before the performance begins. She curtsied, correctly, elegantly, with no excessive flourish. "You are very kind to receive us after such a journey." "I trust the roads were tolerable," he said. "They were not," she replied pleasantly, "but we arrived intact, which is the essential thing." He blinked. He had expected deference, he had expected nerves, he had perhaps expected the species of trembling gratitude that a woman in her circumstances, penniless, unprovided for, dependent upon his agreement to honor a betrothal that no court in England could have compelled him to uphold, might reasonably have been expected to display. He had not expected dry humor delivered with a perfectly straight face. "Indeed," he said, after a pause that lasted perhaps a half-second longer than was entirely comfortable, "indeed, we shall speak more at supper, Miss Ashmore. Mrs. Alderton will show you to your rooms." She inclined her head, and as she turned to follow the housekeeper up the great staircase, Aldric Cavendish did something he had not done in a very long time. He stood and watched someone walk away from him, and he felt, distantly, faintly, like the first intimation of weather on the horizon, the peculiar sensation of wanting to call them back. He did not, of course. He was a duke. He had been schooled since birth in the art of wanting nothing and betraying less. But the feeling stayed with him all the same, quiet and persistent, like a draught beneath a door. Supper was a formal and largely silent affair. The dining room at Ravensmoor could seat 40 with ease, and 2 people seated at the vast mahogany table, candlelight pooling between them in the cavernous dark, occupied it with the precision of chess pieces placed at maximum distance from one another. Silver gleamed, crystal caught the flame. Somewhere beyond the high windows, the wind had picked up, pressing against the glass with the low, mournful persistence of something that wished to come inside. Aldric had intended to be brief and businesslike. He had a speech prepared, mentally at least. The terms of their arrangement would be respected. She would have every comfort, every liberty within reason. He would require her presence at certain social functions. He would not require anything else of her. He had been quite clear on this point, with himself, in the privacy of his study that afternoon. He had perhaps not anticipated that she would ask him questions. "Is the library well stocked?" she asked, between the fish course and the remove, with no more ceremony than if she had inquired about the quality of the soup. "I beg your pardon?" he said. "The library," she repeated, with perfect equanimity. "I noticed it from the upper corridor, the second door on the left, if I am not mistaken, the green velvet curtains, and the rather magnificent problem of too many books for too few shelves." He set down his fork. "You noticed the library from the corridor." "I have a weakness for libraries," she said simply. "One can tell a great deal about a house from its library, its intellectual ambitions, what it values, whether the books have been read or merely purchased for the appearance of scholarship." A pause. "Yours, if I may be so forward, appear to have been read, several of them more than once." There was a silence. The candles shifted in a breath of air from the chimney. "It is well stocked," Aldric said finally. "You may use it whenever you wish." Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, but the antechamber of one. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "That is genuinely the most reassuring thing you might have said to me this evening." He found to his considerable annoyance that he wanted to know what the least reassuring thing might have been. He did not ask. He reached for his wine instead, and the conversation moved on to matters of household management and the expected date of the formal marriage ceremony, and he was efficient and correct and entirely in command of himself. But later, when supper was concluded and she had retired with a quiet good night and a last unreadable glance from the doorway, Aldric sat alone in the flickering dining room for a long time, his glass untouched, listening to the wind batter the windows and thinking about a woman who could deduce the soul of a house from the condition of its bookshelves. 3 weeks passed. They were, in the external mechanics of daily life, entirely uneventful. Vivienne settled into Ravensmoor with a composure that Aldric found alternately admirable and maddening. She breakfasted early and alone. She spent her mornings in the library. He knew this because he sometimes passed the door and heard faintly the soft percussion of pages turning. She walked in the grounds each afternoon regardless of weather, a dark figure moving through the gold and rust of October trees, her cloak pressed against her by the wind, her chin always slightly lifted, as though she were arguing privately with the horizon. She did not seek him out. She did not perform emotions for his benefit. She was courteous when they met, at dinner, at the occasional morning encounter in the corridor, and then she retreated quietly and completely back into the sovereign privacy of herself. He should have been relieved. This was exactly what he wanted, exactly. He found, instead, that he was developing a habit of noticing her absence as keenly as other men might notice a presence, that the library door closed communicated something he could not quite name, that the place at the dinner table where she sat left a different quality of silence when she was not in it. It was on a Thursday, cold, grey, the kind of November day that settles over the English countryside like a reprimand, that everything shifted. He had gone to the library himself, not in search of her. He would have sworn this on any document his solicitor cared to produce. He wanted the bound volume of correspondence from his great-uncle's land agency, which he required for a meeting with his land agent the following morning. That was all. He opened the door. The fire was lit, a generous, crackling fire that had turned the room from its usual cool grandeur into something almost tender. The green velvet curtains were drawn against the pewter sky. The lamp on the reading table was glowing, warm and amber. And she was asleep in his chair. Not the small, apologetic sleep of someone who has dozed off mid-sentence, but the full, vulnerable, unguarded sleep of genuine exhaustion, her head tipped back slightly against the dark leather, one hand open in her lap, the book she had been reading slid half off her fingers and resting on the armrest at a precarious angle. Her hair, and this was what stopped him, entirely and without recourse, her hair was down. Not arranged, not pinned, not any of the elaborate, constructed architecture she wore at dinner, simply down, dark and loose and tumbling over her shoulder onto the lapel of her dressing gown, which he registered with a distant, decorous alarm was what she was wearing, a dressing gown of dark green wool, entirely modest, entirely appropriate for a private morning in a private room, which this had presumably been before he had opened the door without knocking. He should have withdrawn immediately. He knew this. Every principle of propriety, every instinct of gentlemanly conduct, every lesson drilled into him since the age of 6 about the correct behavior of a man of his station commanded him to step backward, pull the door closed with the utmost quiet, and remove himself at once. He stood in the doorway for what he would later estimate, with considerable self-reproach, was approximately 45 seconds. She was not unremarkable. She was the furthest possible thing from unremarkable. She was, without the armor of her careful composure, without the polite distance she maintained between herself and the world, like a hand pressed gently against a door to prevent it opening too wide. She was heartbreaking. That was the word that arrived in his mind with terrible simplicity and refused to be dislodged. The book slid the rest of the way off the armrest and hit the floor with a soft, decisive thud. She woke. Dark eyes, instantly alert. She was not a slow waker, he noted, with the strange irrelevance of a mind scrambling for solid ground, fixing on him from across the room with an expression that moved in rapid succession through surprise, comprehension, and something that might, in a less contained woman, have been embarrassment, but which in Vivienne Ashmore settled almost immediately into a kind of dignified calm that he found, God help him, entirely magnificent. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was slightly rough with sleep. She sat upright, gathered her hair with one practiced motion, reached automatically for the book on the floor, stopped, presumably realizing that bending to retrieve it in her current state of dishabille would only compound the situation, and instead folded her hands in her lap with perfect composure. "I appear to have fallen asleep in your chair." "You appear to have done so, yes," he said. He was still standing in the doorway. He was aware of this. He was, for reasons he could not entirely account for, incapable either of advancing into the room or retreating from it. "I apologize," she said. "I shall—" She moved to rise. "Don't," he said. The word came out before he had authorized it. She paused, and they both registered the abruptness of it at the same moment. He cleared his throat. "That is, the fire is comfortable. You need not rush." A silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pressed against the curtained windows. "You came for a book," she said. Yes." He crossed to the upper left shelf with what he hoped was a reasonable approximation of his normal gait, retrieved the volume he required, and turned back to find her watching him with those dark, steady eyes that gave nothing away and somehow communicated everything. "Are you quite well, Your Grace?" she asked. There was something in the question, not mockery, he would not call it mockery, but the faintest, most carefully calibrated degree of awareness, as though she knew precisely what had happened in the doorway, as though she were offering him the grace of pretending otherwise. "I am perfectly well," he said. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Ashmore." "Vivienne," she said quietly. He stopped. "I beg your pardon?" "My name," she said. "We are to be married, after all. Within the fortnight, as I understand it. I should think—" She paused, and something shifted in her face, something genuine and slightly unsteady, the first crack in that extraordinary composure, so small he might have imagined it. "I should think you might call me Vivienne, if you wished." The fire breathed. A log shifted, sending up a brief cascade of sparks. "Vivienne," he said. And he heard in the single word something he had not heard in his own voice in a very long time, something that sounded with terrible and inconvenient accuracy like the beginning of wanting. The scandal broke the following week. It arrived in the form of a letter, not to him, but to Vivienne, and not through the regular post, but delivered by a private messenger, pressed into Mrs. Prentice's hands on the front steps with an urgency that sent the poor woman fluttering through the corridors of Ravensmoor like a startled hen. Aldric was in his study when Vivienne came to find him. She entered without announcement. He looked up from his correspondence, a sharp word of reproof forming on his lips, and then he saw her face, and the word dissolved. She was pale, not the delicate aesthetic paleness of fashionable sensibility, but the real, functional paleness of someone whose blood has gone elsewhere in a hurry, attending to something more urgent. Her hands were steady. They were always steady, but the letter in them was not. The paper trembled faintly at its edges. "There is a problem," she said. Her voice was level. The effort it cost her to make it so was visible, just barely, in the minute tension at the corner of her jaw. "Sit down,"
he said, immediately. He rose. He was already around the desk before he had consciously made the decision to move. "I should prefer to stand," she said. "What I have to tell you—" She stopped, drew a breath. Aldric, his given name in her mouth for the first time, and under these circumstances, and he felt it like a hand pressed flat against his chest. "My father's debts were greater than anyone knew, greater than was disclosed to your solicitors. There is a creditor, a man named Hartwell, who claims an additional sum that would make the Ashmore estate entirely worthless, less than worthless. The settlement I was to bring to this marriage—" She closed her eyes for a half-second, opened them. "There is no settlement. There is nothing." The room was very quiet. "Hartwell," Aldric said, "has written to you directly." "He has written to me directly," she confirmed. "He intends to go public with the claim. He intends specifically," her voice tightened almost imperceptibly, "he intends to make it known before our marriage can be solemnized, so that any contract signed after the fact would be made in full knowledge of the deception, thereby ensuring that you would have legal grounds—" She stopped. "To void the betrothal," he said. "Yes," she said. "He is evidently a man who enjoys being thorough in his cruelty." The fire, which was lit even in November in his study, because he had never entirely conquered his dislike of cold rooms, ticked and murmured in the grate. Aldric looked at her, at the pale, steady, magnificent architecture of her self-possession as it held, strain and all, against a pressure that might have broken a person of lesser character entirely, and he felt something resolve within him, quietly, without drama, the way a great house might settle into its foundations after a storm. "Sit down, Vivienne," he said more gently this time. This time she sat. He remained standing, not from any desire to loom over her, but because he needed the floor beneath his feet, needed the simple, physical fact of his own weight in his own study to say what he was about to say. "Hartwell's claim is his concern, not mine." She looked up. "The settlement," he continued, "was never the point. It was a formality, a legal accommodation." He paused, chose his next words with the care of a man who has been careless with them for a long time and is newly keenly aware of the cost. "I have means enough for 20 wives, Vivienne, and I have never been under the illusion that you were marrying me for love. I hope—" He stopped, began again. "I hope, equally, that you have not been under the illusion that your value to me was financial." "My value to you," she said carefully, "was contractual." "It was," he said. "It was when you arrived. It has—" He looked at her. He had spent 32 years perfecting the art of revealing nothing. He had learned the art at his father's knee through the worst species of education, observation and consequence. He had worn that reticence like the finest armor, and he looked at this woman, sitting in the firelight of his study, with a letter trembling in her hands, and her extraordinary eyes trained on him with the full, unsparing attention that was apparently simply how she moved through the world, seeing things, perceiving things, insisting by her very presence that the things she saw be real, and he felt the armor, quietly and irreversibly, come off. "It has," he said, "changed." A long silence. "You should not say things you cannot mean," she said very quietly. "Not to me. I do not require comfort. I am trying to—" "Vivienne," he crossed to where she sat. He crouched before her, which was undignified and entirely deliberate, bringing himself level with those dark, careful eyes that were, he saw now, glittering faintly with the tears she would not shed. I am not offering you comfort. I am telling you that when I thought, for the 3 seconds between your telling me about Hartwell's letter and my responding to it, of a version of this conversation in which I let you leave, in which the arrangement was dissolved, and you returned to London, and I continued in this house with its full library and its 40-seat dining room and its absolute echoing silence, I found that I could not bear it.
She stared at him. The tears she had been refusing gathered at the edges of her composure. I am not a man who says such things easily. I have not been, for a very long time, a man who says them at all. But you have been in this house for 3 weeks, and you have managed to make a place in it that was not there before, simply by being precisely, entirely, uncompromisingly yourself. And I am not prepared— his voice, to his distant consternation, was not entirely steady— I am not prepared to lose that, or you, whatever Hartwell writes to whomsoever he chooses. Vivienne Ashmore, who had held herself together with the composure of a woman who had learned early and well that falling apart was a luxury available to those with someone to catch them, looked at the Duke of Ravensmoor for a long, suspended moment. And then she reached out and placed one hand, still in its glove, careful even now, against his jaw. "You are considerably more difficult to dismiss than I had anticipated," she said, her voice just barely unsteady at its edges. "When I arrived, I had fully intended to be efficient, invisible, entirely unimposing." "You have failed spectacularly," he told her. She laughed. It was, he thought, the first time he had heard her truly laugh, not the polite, measured sound of social obligation, but the real thing, brief and unguarded, and it rearranged something in the architecture of his chest with the casualness of someone rearranging furniture. "Write to your solicitor," she said, composing herself, though her hand remained where it was, "and I shall write to Hartwell. I am, as it happens, rather good with difficult correspondence." "I do not doubt it," he said. "We will deal with it," she said, and the "we" of it, the simple, extraordinary "we" landing in the air of his study between them, felt like the first morning of a different kind of life. They married on a Friday in the small chapel on the Ravensmoor grounds, attended only by the household staff and a bewildered but deeply moved Mrs. Prentice, who wept so comprehensively throughout the ceremony that she was obliged to borrow 3 separate handkerchiefs. Vivienne wore deep ivory. She would not wear white, she said, on entirely practical grounds, as ivory was more forgiving of November mud. With no veil. He had asked her the evening before, with a directness that had apparently become a habit between them. "No veil," she had said simply. "I intend from this point forward to be seen." Aldric had looked at her, this woman who had walked into his house a stranger, and his house had not felt the same since, and said, "Good." He had by then read every book she had read in his library, not because she had suggested it, not because it was required of him, because he had picked up one, a well-worn volume of Wollstonecraft she had left on the arm of the green chair, and found, in the margins, her handwriting, small, fierce, occasionally argumentative annotations in pencil, disagreeing with passages, extending arguments, asking questions of the text in the way one might argue with a friend, and he had been unable, having begun, to stop reading. He had carried the book with him for 2 days. He had not told her. She had looked at him across the dinner table on the second evening with an expression that suggested, with no words at all, that she knew entirely, and had chosen to say nothing, because she was Vivienne, and cruelty of any variety was not in her repertoire. Now she stood beside him in the small, cold chapel, and the chaplain spoke the words, and Aldric held her hand, gloved still, because she was, he had come to understand, a woman of layers, each one deliberate, each one eventually, and at her own pace, surrendered, and made his vows. He had once spoken of a marriage in name only. He had meant it, genuinely, at the time. It had been a reasonable, self-protective, entirely explicable intention for a man who had watched love destroy his mother from the inside out.
He thought of this, standing in that cold chapel with the candles lit against the November dark, and the woman beside him making her own vows in that low, steady voice that was from the very first evening entirely its own frequency, one his ear had been apparently tuned to receive without his consent or prior knowledge. He thought, a man is not necessarily the sum of what he has been afraid of, and he pressed his thumb gently against the inside of her wrist through the thin kid leather of her glove, and she looked at him with those dark, assessing, entirely magnificent eyes, and something passed between them that required no words and no ceremony and no legal document, something that was, simply and sufficiently, the truth.
Later, much later, when November had softened into December, and the fires at Ravensmoor burned higher than they ever had in the memory of the household staff, and the 40-seat dining room had been supplemented with a smaller one, warmer and more intimate, where two people could speak without raising their voices, and sometimes did not need to speak at all, Aldric found the letter. It was in the library, tucked inside the back cover of the Woolstonecraft. He had gone to return it to its rightful shelf, and the paper had fallen out, folded small and close, in her handwriting, begun and then abandoned, clearly never meant to be sent or found. "To whoever reads this," it began, in the careful, slightly formal tone of someone addressing uncertainty, "I have arrived at Ravensmoor in the belief that I understand what this is, an arrangement, a rescue, perhaps, or a transaction. I am honest enough with myself to allow both words. I expect nothing of the man I am to marry, except decency. I intend nothing of myself, except endurance. And yet, the library has been read. Every book on that upper left shelf shows the particular wear of a hand that has turned its pages more than once. The chair by the fire is positioned at the angle of someone who sits there often and long. There are annotations, formal, precise, entirely without sentiment, in the margins of the Gibbon and in the Montaigne. I had intended to be invisible here. I am beginning to suspect this house may not cooperate." The letter ended there, unfinished, unrequited, as all the best letters are, until suddenly, one day, they are not. Aldric stood in the library with the small folded page in his hands, and the fire at his back, and his wife somewhere in the upper rooms of this house that was no longer cold, and he felt something he had no particular precedent for feeling, settled, entire, as though a long and arduous journey had concluded not with triumph, but with something better, arrival, the specific, quiet, irreplaceable peace of being precisely where one is supposed to be. He folded the letter carefully. He placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest, where it would remain. His letter, his now, along with the writer of it, who was nobody's rescue and nobody's transaction and nobody's arrangement in name only. She was his wife. She was Vivienne. She was the woman who had walked through his door in October wearing black and a veil and the careful composure of someone who had learned to need very little. And she had, in 3 months and without apparent effort or intention, become everything. Dear listener, if you were moved by this story, please do leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you wish to hear more from the world of The Duke's Lost Letters, you know where to find us. Until next time, may all your letters find their way home.